Perfect. Well, welcome everybody back to this week's OpenShift Origin Community Hangout. We had a wonderful, exciting week this past week, and I've brought a couple of folks who got to go to a wonderful little workshop on the Solum project that was hosted at Rackspace to talk about the design and collaboration efforts that are getting underway for Solum, which is an OpenStack-related initiative that got kicked off at the summit, and we talked about it a little bit in our summit roundup this week. But since I wasn't there, I'm going to let Clayton sort of talk a little bit about what the workshop was, what Solum is, and then we can kick off a conversation about that. So I'm going to hand it off to Clayton Coleman.
Sure. So the face-to-face was really about bringing a bunch of the interested parties together so that we can meet people, developers, architects and interested companies, a real mix of backgrounds. People from the camp committee were there, people from OpenShift, a ton of folks from Rackspace, eBay, and quite a few others, and Docker as well. And the goal really being make a connection and hash out some of the highest level things that we really haven't had a chance to discuss as a group, things that have been discussed on email. But there was a lot of participation in the room, about 30 people there, maybe a few more, a bunch of people on IRC and in the associated Hangout. And we managed to get through quite a few topics of discussion.
I muted myself. I was just doing hand signals here. It looks like there was a lot of very baseline conversation about what Solum is that happened at OpenStack. So maybe if you could reiterate a little bit of that, and then we'll go into, I have the workshop notes, and I did lurk a little bit on the IRC channel during the days that were there.
Sure. Solum is really about making it possible for developers, organizations, operators to put together a way to build or develop, build, and manage a wide variety of web applications in OpenStack. So OpenStack offers a ton of infrastructure that allows you to start and provision resources dynamically. Heat offers a ton of emerging capabilities for composing components of OpenStack. And Solum built on top of that to allow an organization to define their own build and life cycle around their applications. And there's always a goal here of, most of the time, most organizations and most people develop applications in a few ways, and there's a lot of best practices. And Solum is about trying to codify some of those best practices into OpenStack in a way that leverages Heat fully, that leverages the capabilities of the platform, and takes some of the burden off developers to do things like creating Heat templates, spinning up machines, and gives IT administrators greater control over how those applications are deployed and how those applications are managed. So everybody benefits. The IT organization gets to have stronger control over the lifecycle of those applications, where those applications are provisioned, how they're managed, what can happen to them. And developers get a set of tools and the ability to integrate their own tools into this flow so that they can more efficiently develop and effectively deliver those applications.
So I know there was some discussion about like what workflow tools people would still be using. So it sounds like they get to still use whatever they're using for their own workflow tools, and Solum is going to be leveraging that basic understanding going forward.
It's really important. The largest organizations and the biggest teams have very strongly opinionated flows. As an example, the OpenStack community has a very automated process. It's designed to take contributions from hundreds of developers, test those rigorously, combine them with contributions from other developers, and really set up an ecosystem whereby a set of developers can contribute. Well, that's one extreme. And I think one thing that we found over time is that large organizations come up with tools and processes that match they're meeting social and political problems. And so in order to really leverage the systems that people already have and create, the idea would be that Solum can provide the kind of simple flow that small developers, someone working by themselves can leverage quite easily, and an IT organization can kind of use out of the box. But we really need to be cognizant that there's a ton of tooling in the world that we're not trying to reinvent. Things like Garrett, GitHub, Jenkins, continuous integration and continuous deployment strategies that organizations are already using. And instead, Solum in that case is an enabler for some aspects of the pipeline and some common mechanisms for talking to those infrastructures, but not necessarily being in control of the whole flow.
The other thing that was, I know, a topic there was how the process, we call them cartridges, Docker calls them containers, but the whole idea of how you package up an application and deploy it. What was the design decisions, if there were any, or the design focus around how containerization is going to be handled?
There's so one of the things that's been proposed and discussed is that a really powerful way to bundle up a set of software and its dependencies is a stack, and kind of a process. Today, an application developer might use Capistrano if they're on Ruby. They might use custom tools to build VM images. They might use Maven to generate a build artifact, and then they'd have a bunch of custom automation that takes that build artifact and sends it to a server. And there's an emerging trend around what are called immutable servers, and this idea is already being used at some of the biggest companies out there, and Docker, in a sense, is providing this in an efficient way. So today you could start with an image on OpenStack or on EC2, and you could run some commands against it and snapshot that image, and then you can deploy that image in a lot of places. So VMs have a lot of size overhead, and so it's not as easy as it should be to schlep around 7 gigs of data. What Docker really enables that has been very difficult before is the idea of breaking all those pieces down into layers, and the technologies by which they do that are really interesting. But what Docker enables is the idea of shipping around a set of discrete layers, and if a bunch of people share those layers, then really all you're talking about is the delta. So it's a lot easier to ship those around. And so what you can have is a bunch of people who are using these immutable server images, which is just really another way of saying a pre-canned operating system stack that includes your application, shipping that around to a bunch of different places in an efficient manner, and being able to start those up in large numbers. And so the idea that we've been discussing in the Solum face-to-face and on the mailing lists is starting with some sort of base image and making a transition to an image that can be deployed. And we see this as, in OpenShift today, when you push a change to your cartridge, we're making changes on disk, but there's a beginning state and an end state. And really what this, kind of the idea, the next step, where I think we see Docker and OpenStack and even OpenShift going, is being able to start with a base and define the process by which that base gets transformed into something that can get deployed. And so right now in the mailing lists, we put up there's a spec that we kind of drafted based on what was in the face-to-face, and we're going to be iterating on those discussions. And then how it applies to OpenShift is really the next step. We'd like to be compatible with something that's evolving in the community and is based on all these best practices and really allows OpenShift and OpenStack to leverage the strengths of Docker and VMs in a way that also allows even the largest organizations to build and distribute these kind of images that give them real deep control over what's going on in their application environments.
So just one point to add to that, Diane, is you mentioned workflow previous to the topic of the actual deployment unit that Clayton just discussed, and one of the things that Krishna and the group laid out during the meetup was that you have these corporations or large groups of people that have a lot of infrastructure in place. We want to provide 2 different flows, one where you can hook into CI systems and review systems build systems, but also be able to roll your own container and put everything in place and create your own deployment unit, and then just drop that into Solum and have it take over with the orchestration workflow. So we definitely want to provide binary deployment as well as source-based deployment.
So it looked like, too, from the notes from the workshop that I have, is that one of the next steps was to build a blueprint or to build a sample, what I think you were calling a language pack, and that was one of the things that was going to come out of here. And I know part of my trepidation sometimes, I don't want to call this an OpenStack project yet. It's not even an incubation yet. It's still really a design phase thing. But the OpenStack has a specific process for taking on new projects and new things. And a lot of the hullabaloo about OpenStack that's been in Twitter world and pundits the past month or two or three probably is growing these new feature sets such as Solum and stuff. So I know the Solum group is being very cognizant of the process, and I think the next step is really to build a blueprint for Solum. What does that all entail, and what are the sort of next steps there? Everybody's muted.
So just for clarity around the process to evolve a project that's related to OpenStack, there are a set of blueprints. There's no single project blueprint. It's a blueprint per major feature that smaller groups of community members within the project can work on together to design. So a lot of work goes on in parallel. And so as that evolves and commits come in and features are developed and weaved together, the project will take shape and move through the process.
So one of the projects, blueprint projects, I guess, that people are working on the creating of what is called a language pack. I think that was something, and I know that's something that's sort of near and dear. How is a language pack different than, say, the thing that brings to mind is like a build pack or a cartridge? That's more of a...
And language pack is something that in the face-to-face we said, we want to come up with a good term that really represents what it is, because it's a lot broader than just languages. I guess the idea would be that when we think about it, is, as I was talking before, where you start with something, a base, and you transport it into something deployable, that really opens it up so that, in a sense, you have the ability to plug into the entire world of possibilities. Anything you can do with a single system, both through Docker and through a VM, would be something that we would enable through Solum. These language packs, which is the term that's being used right now, would have a real simple contract. And the idea would be that there would be a Big Ten approach where things like OpenShift cartridges, things like Heroku build packs, things like Windows, everybody can build a process that is tailored to their specific needs and contribute to them. Because really the base idea is if you can set up if you can start from someplace in an operating system and change it so that that operating system is going to be an execution environment for your code, then you can build a language pack around it. So for instance, you can build a language pack that supports MySQL. That is, just the simple series of steps that might start from a Fedora 19 base image. It yum installs MySQL, and then make sure that MySQL is identified as the process that needs to get run every time this instance or this image gets started up. And by doing that, we can really say, well, we can support VMs, we can support Docker containers. If you look at where the direction of the spec might evolve to, it's going to look a lot like a Docker file. It's also going to have metadata that's associated with it, just like OpenShift cartridges. And the mechanisms by which these things are built up actually has a lot in common with Heroku build packs. Heroku build pack actually works just on Ubuntu 12, and it depends on a number of specific things on the system. Anything else that it doesn't have, you have to go and download it and install it. Well, I think one of the things that we're hoping to enable is that different communities of developers, not just people on Ubuntu, not just people on RHEL, not just people on Windows or Macs, can build up a set of recipes that allow them to get to the point that they want to. They want to use Puppet, they want to use Chef, they want to use Yum. But really the idea is to set up just the simplest possible abstraction that works for all of these and let organizations build a process. OpenStack wants to be vendor neutral. OpenStack wants to be a big tent that allows everybody to build environments that can be run. And while we think Docker and containers and a couple of very specific things are the best way to do that on Linux, from an OpenStack perspective, I may already be running in a form where I can take an image and build an image out of it and then deploy it via heat to a number of large things. And we want to be flexible to that in the long term.
So that brings up another thing, and I'm sorry if this question seems a little random, but what are the mechanics that you guys are thinking about in terms of pulling from GitHub? So you've got your language packs or whatever it ends up being called, that whole framework and the containers. But how is Solomon going to interact with GitHub and getting my application into? Is a mechanism being thought about for that?
So I think Solum wants to allow operators. Git is really important, but there's a lot of organizations out there in the world that are still running on Subversion, and so one of the things that we've talked about as we've gone through this process is making it an operator choice how they want to deploy and handle source code control. So for instance, organizations that use GitHub publicly, organizations that use GitHub Enterprise, organizations that already have a centralized source code control solution would be able to kind of work to simply, or maybe not so simply, plug in so that Solum itself really doesn't have to care about how you manage source control. Solum gives you a vehicle by which you could do it. And I think there'd be a reference implementation, some really strong examples out there in the OpenStack community that would allow, for instance, if you said this application is built so that it uses this public GitHub repository. And so really when a change happens to that repository, GitHub, for instance, today has something called a webhook that allows, or it's, I think they call it just a repository hook. But it's essentially when a commit comes in, GitHub can make an HTTP request to an arbitrary server and tell it that a new code change is available. And so that works for a Git repository you run on your local system. It can make a curl command that says, hey, go run this when someone makes a commit. It can work with Subversion. Subversion has very similar concepts. So I think one of the ideas we've been discussing is that you'd be able to set this hook up from GitHub, for example, and when something changes, Solum would know how to go and pull down your repository and pass it into the language pack. The language pack would then be able to take that, extract the source, do whatever it needs to do, and each language pack might define a different set of rules. So a Java Maven language pack would look at the source code repository and say, oh, here's a Maven file, I can just execute this in the root. And I expect to get a war file out. And then I'm going to deploy that war file using Tomcat. So that might be one particular combination of choices. But at the end of the day, that source file gets shoved in, a build step runs, or whatever you want to call it, a preparation step. And at the end of that preparation step, that image is ready to then be copied out to a number of places and started. And when the image starts, it has the, it's running Tomcat on port 8080, and the war file is deployed. So there's going to be a lot of work over the coming weeks and months to try and flush out this flow, but that's really the target of the first milestone for Solum, which was one of the things at the face-to-face that came up a lot, was trying to get this flow where you go from a Git repository, we take a language pack, we inject the source code, and we run some sort of build process inside the language pack, and then the outcome of that is something that we can then pass on to Heat and tell Heat to go deliver a bunch of these and provision them as either VMs or Docker images in OpenStack.
So then, so you provision them, okay? So, and I'm going to say first is that there is no code yet in Solum. This is all design talk. So this is, sometimes say this is building and whatever. This is all still in flux and being talked about. So if folks have ideas or other use cases that they want to see talked about, the website with all the links is solum.io or solum.io, or you can ping us on the Origin site, and we'll give you some links as well. But one of the things is we talk a lot about how do we build these images or containers and how do we get our applications there. But once we've got them deployed, how are we managing them? There's the heat orchestration that we do with heat templates in Origin now, but things like load balancing and the things that actually make your applications once they're going. How are we going to manage load balancing and scale and things like that? What's the story behind that people are thinking about? Chris? Can you take a stab at that?
Myself. So we talked a bit about this at the meetup this week. We are looking to not re-implement load balancing as a service within Solum, but use existing projects and work that's underway. There is a load balancing as a service project under the Neutron umbrella that we are looking to use, and then there's also a project called Libra that our friends at HP have been working on. So we're working with both of those groups to define and help shape what type of requirements we need to have implemented to be able to do things like when an application is created, we need to have a hook to make a DNS entry. We also are very interested in designing Solum to be very scalable out of the gates. We realize that we need to start in a simple manner. However, we don't want to paint ourselves into a corner, so to speak. We would like to be able to do things like horizontally scale the load balancing tier such that we can do things like segment groups of load balancers such that we can have a highly available routing service, layer 7 routing service above Solum. So any other features that we discussed that I didn't cover?
I think you got it from what I could see from the notes and what I noticed lurking on the IRC channel, though I did hear the word badger used or something at one point.
Okay, so Clayton just talked about the language pack idea and basically how you define your execution environment. And we weren't quite settled on the term language pack, so we just sort of substituted the term badger as a very generic, meaningless word to describe a language pack. So they're synonymous, and that both terms are likely to change.
That's what I figured, but I figured every project needs some animal icon, and I was like, yeah, finally, and I can pronounce the word badger, which is a wonderful thing.
And we've already used a panda, so might as well go with badger.
Well, and badgers dig through the soil, and if we're talking about layers under the soil, then you kind of have this badger that comes through and kind of ties it all together.
Yeah, we have moles and ants and all kinds of other things too. But anyways, one of the questions that I wanted to make sure that we cover today is, because this is an OpenShift Origin community hangout, is really perhaps address why OpenShift Origin users should really care about Solum at all, and perhaps what's the impact on Origin's roadmap of all of this effort? Because we've talked about OpenStack a lot last week and Solum this week, and we're not actually talking about, and we will in our next community hangout, what's in Origin v3 release that's up and coming. So watch out, Krishna, you'll have to talk next week. But if you, maybe Clayton, if you could address that a little bit about why should an OpenShift Origin, someone who's deployed Origin or is using OpenShift Online, why should they give a hoot about Solum?
So I think the easiest answer for right now is that there is a ton of capabilities in OpenStack that we want to be able to leverage over time. This kind of is one of those fundamentals about the goal of a PaaS is to make it easier for developers and for IT administrators. And we've given IT administrators a lot of power, but we want to give them even more. And so to do that, we need OpenStack, because OpenStack is the open way of managing an IT infrastructure from a hardware and a resource perspective. In addition, there's a lot of awesome things that are being done in OpenStack, like Marconi, which is a simple message and queuing service. There's Trove, which is designed to allow people to flexibly design really scalable and performant systems that can be allocated, similar to Amazon RDS. So long term, we think there's a ton of great capabilities that are going to emerge in the open source community around OpenStack that's going to let people run clouds that can take advantage of a bunch of these flexible capabilities. But in the short term, where we want to go, and this is, I think, one of the reasons that we were so excited to see Project Solum get started up, was there's a lot of things that we can do to move containers forward and to move software delivery forward. And Docker is really a linchpin of that, because Docker is doing things that allow us to say we're going to take containers, which is really just a set of processes, and Docker has a great experience designed around those, which is allowing you to quickly and easily spin one up, make changes to it, snapshot that, create another one based on that, and then also to build Docker files, which allow you to kind of describe this. And anybody who's seen the similarity between what a Docker file kind of lets you do and what a cartridge lets you do, to us it's obvious that Docker files and Docker images is really the next step that we want to take to make it easier for someone to go build their own cartridges. So we have downloadable cartridges today. One of the things about cartridges today is that they need to run on RHEL 6.5. And not only do they need to run on RHEL 6.5, the best place to develop a cartridge is on OpenShift. And so I think the biggest, most concrete thing I can say is that we'd love to be able to enable OpenShift to be able to let developers go and build cartridges that use the operating systems they want, the packages they want, allows them to install packages, and then work with a community like OpenStack and OpenStack Solum to figure out what the best model is to do that. And the Solum language pack model, I think, is a very powerful way of describing, what we want to, where we want OpenShift to go, is to be able to offer all these capabilities. I can download a running gear from OpenShift and be able to run it locally. Well, Docker would let us do that. And so I think that there's a really powerful alignment of timing, is that we want to build out a really great Docker story. The Project Solum is just getting ramped up, and they want to use infrastructure really deeply. One of the two things that everybody needs to agree on is, what's the next iteration of cartridges. And so I think that, for us, it's really getting to that point where we can make that next step to give, people the ability to run what they want, where they want, and when they want it.
So I think I hear a couple of things in that message for OpenShift Origin folks. Perhaps look for a cartridge v3 conversation.
Maybe.
Sometime
soon.
Maybe January, February timeframe. Not that I'm saying anything, but I think there's a conversation about the next generation of cartridges that's probably coming down the pipe soon. And so our friends and family that have deployed lots of cartridges or built them and put them in the community site, pay attention to that message. And for Origin, we're still going to be there in terms of doing every 3 months or so, she says, a release of Origin with new features and functions and tweaks. So that doesn't really change. This is sort of a parallel set of projects that are going on that I think are quite necessary in terms of the evolution of PaaS as a technology. And there's been a lot of blogging about that recently, so I think that all is really telling us that we're pointing in the right direction.
And I can neither confirm nor deny the existence of a cartridge v3, but I can say that one of the things that, as we've been thinking about all of this, right, you could take an OpenShift gear and run it inside a Docker container today. And so we see there's just a very natural way of iterating for every single one of the cartridges out there. And that's awesome to us, right? Like, if you see a technology that's so powerful that you can take everything you do today and bundle it all up and run it in a way that gives everybody individual control over, what versions they're running. I mean, that's just, when you see that happen, you're like, oh wow, this is going to really change how things work. And so we've been really interested in leveraging Docker to its full.
All right. So I think we've just hit a half an hour. I might pull it to a close now, because a half an hour is a long time to listen to a YouTube video, even though you guys are awesome. So, Chris, do you have anything else that you wanted to add to this? Is there another Solum workshop planned in the offing, or is that all going to take place on the mailing list and happen that way?
Well, I think a lot of it's going to happen on IRC and the mailing list. One of the other things that we didn't really touch on that I thought was very important is although the commits are starting to trickle in for the Solum project around just getting the base framework for the project. One of the things that we went over towards the end of our meetup in San Francisco this week was that we really wanted to get down to defining the smallest amount of deliverable functionality in the short term, such that we can start making rapid progress. One of the things that I think a lot of the folks that have been involved with the project have seen in the past is that if you take a project that is feature rich and it becomes a huge monolithic idea, and then just throw a bunch of developers and sell the community and sell the project and get a bunch of people involved, that it sort of deadlocks on itself and doesn't make a lot of progress. So what we've done towards the end of this week, I guess it was Wednesday, we scoped out milestones and what can be delivered in very short time frames. So we're going to go through Git-based deployment and then really define and implement the language stack and framework around deployment units. So that's probably the last piece that I want to make sure that folks have their head around, is that although there's a lot of blueprints and a lot of feedback going on around a lot of different feature sets that make an application lifecycle management a feasible solution, we are at the point of defining milestones and assigning people to work on small features.
Awesome. So there'll be something to demonstrate sometime, not too distant in the future, which will be even more fun. So that would be great. So there isn't a workshop coming up. Get on the IRC channel. The IRC channel is just pound Solum, S-O-L-U-M, or jump on OpenShift-dev and look for Alfonso Krishna Raman, Clayton Coleman. Jennifer Forrester has also been doing some work, and Dan Mace. Is that the right Dan?
Jessica.
Jessica. Okay, sorry, Jessica.
And Dan McPherson.
Dan McPherson. There's a lot of Dans here. So, anyways, there's a lot of folks on the OpenShift team that they're working with the Solum effort, and we'll be happy to chat with anybody that you'd like to, if you'd like to get more information. But always, if you'd like to go to solum.io and then get a whole rack of stuff there, and you can join the mailing list there. So, once again, thank you guys for coming up and stepping up and being my topic of the week. And we'll get back to all of you again next week, and we'll make Krishna talk a little bit next week. And he's not parallel processing on 3 different IRC channels at the same time with IRC meetings. So maybe next week we'll talk about what's going on in Nova and your container API and drag some more volunteers into that effort. It's been very interesting to see how closely tied some of the OpenStack community is with what we're doing in OpenStack. We have a good affinity going on between the two communities. We really like to see that. So thanks again for joining us today, and we'll be back next week, same time.
Thanks, Dan.